In the early 8th century, the Iberian Peninsula stood on the brink of a transformation that would shape its destiny for centuries. The land, once ruled by the Visigothic kingdom, was a patchwork of territories bound by fragile alliances and riven by internal disputes. Against this backdrop of division and uncertainty, the Islamic conquest began. A swift and astonishing campaign that ushered in the era of Al-Andalus and planted the seeds for the long and complex saga known as the Reconquista. The story opens in 711. When Berber general Tariq ibn Ziyad led his forces across the narrow strait from North Africa into Iberia. According to sources such as Ibn Abd al-Hakim, the motivations for the invasion lay not only in the expansionist ambitions of the Umayyad Caliphate, but also in the deep fractures within Visigothic society. The Visigothic kingdom, which had dominated most of Iberia for centuries, was beset by internal struggles, succession disputes, and factions such as the Wittizans, a group that, some accounts suggest, invited outside assistance in their quest for power. These divisions, more than overwhelming military might, opened the way for the rapid advance of the Muslim armies. The conquest progressed with remarkable speed. Within just a few years, by the early 720s, the Visigothic regime had collapsed across most of the peninsula. Tariq ibn Ziyad and his superior, Musa ibn Nusayr, led a campaign that swept through cities and strongholds, encountering resistance in some places but rarely facing a united opposition. By the early 720s, the conquest was essentially complete, and nearly all of Iberia had passed from Christian to Muslim rule. The transformation was so rapid that later chroniclers, both Muslim and Christian, struggled to capture the sense of upheaval and possibility that must have gripped the land. With the Visigothic kingdom vanquished, the victors established a new political order, Al-Andalus. Initially, this region was a province of the wider Umayyad Caliphate, governed from distant Damascus. Over time, as the fortunes of the Umayyads shifted, Al-Andalus evolved into its own center of power. It became first an emirate, then a caliphate in its own right, with its capital at Córdoba radiating political authority and cultural brilliance. The boundaries of Al-Andalus would shift often in the centuries to come, but its presence as the dominant force on the peninsula remained unchallenged for generations. Yet even as the new rulers consolidated their authority, resistance simmered in the north. In the mountainous region of Asturias, a small band of Christian survivors gathered under the leadership of Pelagius of Asturias. Their stand at Covadonga, traditionally dated to 722, though modest in scale, would come to be seen as the spark that ignited centuries of resistance, the first glimmer of what would later be called the Reconquista. While the details of these early encounters are often shrouded in legend and later embellishment, historians generally agree that the survival and persistence of these northern enclaves played an outsized role in shaping the peninsula's future. The term Reconquista is generally applied to the Christian resistance that began after the consolidation of Muslim rule in the early 720s, with the Battle of Covadonga marking its traditional starting point. The political and religious landscape of Iberia after the conquest was both complex and dynamic. Al-Andalus was not a monolithic society, it was a tapestry woven from many threads. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension. This coexistence, known as convivencia, became a defining feature of the region. Cities like Córdoba would, in time, become renowned not only for their political power, but also for their cultural vibrancy, serving as crossroads where knowledge, art, and science flowed between the Islamic world and Christian Europe. Under the Caliphate of Córdoba, especially from the 10th century onward, Al-Andalus reached its zenith. The city of Córdoba itself emerged as a beacon of learning and culture. Advances in science and medicine flourished, and the arts, architecture, poetry, music were cultivated with passion and expertise. The libraries of Córdoba, filled with manuscripts from across the world, became legendary. Al-Andalus thus served as a conduit, a place where intellectual currents from the East mingled with those of the West, leaving an indelible mark on the development of European civilization. Yet this society was not free from conflict or instability. While the ideal of convivencia often prevailed, the reality was more nuanced. Power struggles, both within the Muslim elite and between religious communities, were a recurring feature of life in Al-Andalus. The region's history unfolded in cycles, a pattern later noted by thinkers such as Ibn Khaldun, who wrote about the importance of asabaya, or group cohesion, in the rise and fall of dynasties. As long as the rulers of Al-Andalus maintained unity and purpose, their civilization flourished. When divisions deepened and unity frayed, decline followed. The initial unity of Al-Andalus, forged in the aftermath of conquest, was tested time and again. Over the centuries, the political structure of the region shifted. The powerful Caliphate of Cordoba eventually fractured into smaller, often competing Taifa kingdoms. This fragmentation weakened Muslim rule and created new opportunities for the Christian kingdoms of the north to expand their influence. Yet even during periods of division, the legacy of Al-Andalus as a center of learning and a land of mingled faiths endured. The early Christian resistance, centered in the rugged north, was never fully extinguished. The Kingdom of Asturias, founded after the conquest, became a nucleus around which other Christian polities would eventually gather. For generations, these kingdoms, Asturias, León, Navarre, Aragon, and later Castile, remained small and embattled, hemmed in by the power of Al-Andalus. But their persistence shaped the narrative of the peninsula, providing a counterpoint to the dominant Muslim presence and laying the foundations for the centuries-long struggle that would become the Reconquista. At its core, this struggle was a contest not only for territory but also for identity. The Christian kingdoms of the north saw themselves as heirs to a lost Visigothic legacy, custodians of a faith and way of life displaced by conquest. Their resistance, though often driven by pragmatic concerns, was also imbued with religious significance. Over time, the idea of reclaiming the peninsula for Christianity would gather force, becoming more than a military campaign, a crusade, in the minds of many, to restore what had been lost. Meanwhile, life in Al-Andalus was marked by both opportunity and uncertainty. For Muslims, the region offered a new frontier, a chance to build a society that drew on the traditions of the wider Islamic world while adapting to local realities. For Christians and Jews who remained under Muslim rule, life could be both prosperous and precarious. The ideal of convivencia meant they could often participate in public life, contribute to the economy, and engage in scholarly pursuits. Yet the balance of power was always shifting, and the degree of tolerance could vary dramatically depending on the political climate. The relationship between the Christian and Muslim worlds was thus one of both conflict and exchange. While wars and raids were frequent, so too were alliances, treaties, and moments of cultural borrowing. The Christian kingdoms, even as they fought to expand their territories, often looked to Al-Andalus as a model of sophisticated governance and culture. Knowledge crossed borders, sometimes carried by captives, sometimes by willing travelers, enriching both societies in unexpected ways. As the centuries passed, the boundaries of Al-Andalus waxed and waned. The initial conquest had given the Muslims control over nearly all the peninsula, but the Christian enclaves in the north endured, and over time, their fortunes improved. The process by which these small kingdoms evolved into powerful states capable of challenging Al-Andalus was gradual and uneven, shaped by the interplay of political ambition, religious zeal, and shifting alliances. The Reconquista, as it would come to be known, was never a straightforward or inevitable march toward Christian victory. It was a long and winding road, marked by advances and setbacks, periods of stalemate, and bursts of dramatic change. The very word Reconquista suggests a campaign of recovery, but the reality was far more complex. What began as a struggle for survival in the remote mountains of Asturias after the consolidation of Muslim rule in the early 720s, traditionally marked by the Battle of Covadonga in 722, would, over the course of centuries, become a defining feature of Iberian history. Through this lens, the Twilight of Al-Andalus appears not as a single event, but as a protracted era of transformation. The conquest of the peninsula by Tariq ibn Ziyad and Musa ibn Nusayr set in motion a chain of events whose echoes would be felt for generations. The rise of Al-Andalus brought new forms of government, new expressions of culture, and new patterns of coexistence. The persistent resistance of the Christian north ensured that the story of the peninsula would be one of contest as well as exchange. By the time Al-Andalus reached its height under the Caliphate of Cordoba, the seeds of future conflict and change had already been sown. The early cycles of unity and division, of conquest and resistance, defined the landscape in which the Reconquista would unfold. The peninsula became a land of shifting frontiers, where the boundaries between faiths and cultures were both fiercely defended and, at times, remarkably porous. In the centuries that followed, these dynamics only intensified. The political, religious, and cultural landscape of medieval Spain was never static. It was a world in constant flux, shaped by the ambitions of rulers, the migrations of peoples, and the enduring aspirations of communities seeking to define their own destinies. The Reconquista, in all its complexity, would be both a product and a driver of these forces. A saga born in the twilight of Al-Andalus, traditionally considered to have begun after the consolidation of Muslim rule in the early 720s with the Battle of Covadonga, and destined to reshape the very identity of the Iberian Peninsula. In the shadow of soaring mountains, and along the ever-shifting frontiers of the Iberian Peninsula, the Reconquista unfolded as one of the longest and most complex struggles of the medieval world. For nearly 8 centuries, Christian and Muslim realms vied for dominance, their fortunes rising and falling with military victories, dynastic rivalries, shifting alliances, and the passions of faith. Traditionally, the Reconquista is considered to have begun after the consolidation of Muslim rule in the early 720s, particularly with the Christian victory at the Battle of Covadonga in 722, and ended with the fall of Granada in 1492. This was not a single, continuous campaign, but rather a series of wars, truces, and negotiations, punctuated by moments of profound transformation, moments that would shape the destinies of Spain and Portugal and reverberate far beyond their borders. The story of the Reconquista is inseparable from the land itself, a landscape marked by steep passes, fertile river valleys, and a patchwork of fortified towns. In these territories, the balance of power constantly shifted as kingdoms and principalities pressed their claims and defended their borders. After the initial consolidation of Muslim rule, Christian resistance in the north gradually coalesced into new centers of power. Over time, these would evolve into the formidable kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, and Portugal, names that would become synonymous with the Christian reconquest. The earliest centuries of the Reconquista, beginning in the early 720s, were characterized by sporadic warfare and local skirmishes, but as the Christian polities grew stronger, their ambitions expanded. Progress was slow and uncertain. At times, the Christian advance stalled in the face of Muslim resurgence, while at other moments, internal divisions among Muslim rulers opened opportunities. The great turning points of this era were rarely inevitable, but rather the result of contingency, calculation, and sometimes sheer luck. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Reconquista was the way the political map of Iberia became a mosaic of overlapping claims and shifting allegiances. The disintegration of the powerful Muslim caliphate into smaller Taifa kingdoms in the 11th century fundamentally altered the dynamics of the conflict. These taifas, often rivals among themselves, sometimes sought support from Christian neighbors, offering tribute or alliances in exchange for protection against other Muslim factions. Such arrangements meant that war and diplomacy were deeply intertwined. The lines between friend and foe were frequently blurred, and alliances shifted with the fortunes of war. The Christian kingdoms, too, were far from unified. Castile, Aragon, and Portugal each followed their own paths, shaped by geography, dynastic politics, and the ambitions of the rulers. Castile, with its broad plains and expanding frontiers, emerged as a powerful force, especially as it absorbed neighboring Leon and other territories. Aragon, rooted in the mountainous northeast, developed its own identity and would eventually look beyond the peninsula to the Mediterranean. Portugal, occupying the far west, gradually asserted its independence and carved out a distinct trajectory, culminating in the formation of a separate nation-state. As the centuries passed, the Reconquista took on the character of a crusade, drawing Christian knights from across Europe to its banners. The language of holy war, common in the era, infused the struggle with religious fervor. Military orders such as the Knights of Santiago and Calatrava played significant roles, building castles, defending the frontiers, and organizing campaigns. The idea that the reconquest was not merely a political ambition, but a divinely sanctioned mission, became increasingly prominent in the rhetoric of Christian rulers and chroniclers. Yet, the distinction between the Iberian Reconquista and the Crusades of the Holy Land was always apparent. While both were shaped by religious zeal, the Reconquista was also deeply local, rooted in the realities of the Iberian frontier, a place where Christians, Muslims, and Jews continued to live, work, and sometimes fight side by side. The frontier, as historians have noted, was not just a line on a map but a zone of interaction, marked by both violence and cultural exchange. Throughout the long centuries of conflict, certain battles assumed legendary status, their outcomes sending ripples across the peninsula. The capture of Toledo in 1085 by Alfonso VI of Castile stands as one such pivotal moment. Toledo, once a great city of the Visigoths and a center of learning under Muslim rule, became a symbol of Christian revival. Its conquest opened the heartland of Al-Andalus to further Christian advances and set the stage for new phases of the struggle. Soon after, the balance shifted again. In response to the growing Christian threat, the Taifas called upon the Almoravids, a powerful Berber dynasty from North Africa, for aid. The arrival of the Almoravids in Iberia marked a new and formidable phase of Muslim resistance. Stern defenders of orthodoxy, the Almoravids reinvigorated the defense of Al-Andalus, halting Christian advances and at times even reclaiming lost ground. Their successors, the Almohads, would continue this tradition, bringing further waves of reform and military might from across the strait. The interventions of these North African dynasties reveal the interconnectedness of the Iberian conflict with the wider Islamic world. The fortunes of the peninsula were never isolated, but rather linked to events in North Africa and beyond. As power shifted, so too did the strategies of both Christian and Muslim rulers, who adapted to new realities and emerging threats. Amid this tumult, figures emerged whose exploits became the stuff of legend. Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, better known as El Cid, was among the most celebrated. A skilled warrior and shrewd diplomat, El Cid served both Christian and Muslim lords at different times, navigating the complex allegiances of the era. His campaigns in eastern Spain, especially around Valencia, exemplify the fluidity of loyalties that characterized the period. Later centuries would recast El Cid as a paragon of Christian chivalry, but the reality of his life reflects the pragmatic and sometimes ambiguous nature of frontier warfare. The 12th and 13th centuries brought renewed momentum to the Christian cause. The fragmentation of Muslim power continued, particularly after the decline of the Almohads. The decisive Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 marked a watershed. Here, the combined armies of Castile, Aragon, and Navarre inflicted a shattering defeat on the Almohad forces. This victory broke the back of organized Muslim resistance in central Iberia and opened vast territories to Christian conquest. In its aftermath, Christian armies surged southward, capturing major cities such as Córdoba, Seville, and Murcia. By the mid-13th century, only the Emirate of Granada remained as a significant Muslim stronghold. The consolidation of Christian rule was not merely a matter of military conquest. It involved the reorganization of society, the introduction of new legal and political systems, and the gradual transformation of the cultural landscape. The resettlement of conquered lands brought people from the north to the south, changing the demographic makeup of the peninsula. The famous school of translators in Toledo, for example, flourished in this era, serving as a bridge between the intellectual traditions of the Islamic world and Christian Europe. The movement of ideas, as much as armies, shaped the character of medieval Spain. While Castile, Aragon, and Portugal expanded their frontiers, the Kingdom of Granada endured. Protected by its mountainous terrain and a willingness to pay tribute to its Christian neighbors, Granada became a refuge for Muslims displaced from other parts of Iberia. Its rulers navigated a precarious existence, balancing internal pressures and external threats as they sought to preserve their autonomy. The closing act of the Reconquista unfolded in the late 15th century as the balance of power shifted decisively in favor of the Christian kingdoms. The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469 laid the foundation for a unified Spanish monarchy capable of mounting a concerted campaign against Granada. The final siege of Granada, culminating in its surrender in 1492, brought an end to Muslim rule in Iberia. The event was celebrated in Christian chronicles as the fulfillment of a centuries-long mission, but its consequences were far-reaching and complex. The impact of the Reconquista was felt in every corner of the peninsula. It reshaped political boundaries, redefined identities, and set the stage for the emergence of Spain and Portugal as powerful nation-states. The triumph of the Christian kingdoms was accompanied by sweeping changes in social, religious, and cultural life. The establishment of the Spanish Inquisition in the late 15th century signaled a new phase of religious uniformity and intolerance as efforts to enforce Catholic orthodoxy intensified. Yet, the legacy of the Reconquista defies simple narratives. The centuries of conflict produced not only enduring enmity, but also periods of coexistence and cultural exchange. The frontier was a place where languages, customs, and beliefs mingled, as well as a zone of tension and violence. The memory of the Reconquista would be invoked in later centuries to bolster national myths and political agendas, but its reality was far more nuanced, a testament to the complexity of medieval Iberia. The ebb and flow of the Reconquista, with its cycles of conquest and loss, shaped the destinies of countless individuals and communities. From the fortified towns of Castile to the palaces of Granada, from the councils of Christian kings to the courts of Muslim emirs, the struggle for Iberia was a crucible in which identities were forged, traditions challenged, and new possibilities imagined. The story of the Reconquista is not only a tale of battles and sieges, but also of resilience, adaptation, and the enduring power of faith and ambition. As the dust settled on the battlefields and new banners fluttered above ancient cities, the Iberian Peninsula emerged transformed. The long struggle had ended, but its echoes would linger for generations, shaping the languages, cultures, and aspirations of those who called this land home. The legacy of the Reconquista, its triumphs, tragedies, and ambiguities, remains woven into the fabric of Spain and Portugal, a reminder that history is rarely a straight path, but rather a tapestry of competing dreams and hard-won realities. On a cold January morning in 1492, the city of Granada surrendered. Though anticipated for years, the event carried a weight that was both immediate and symbolic, the conclusion of centuries of shifting frontiers and ambitions on the Iberian Peninsula. At the forefront stood Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, whose banners now fluttered from the towers of the Alhambra. For the last Muslim ruler of Granada, Muhammad XII, also known as Boabdil, known to Castilian chroniclers as Boabdil, handing over the keys of his city to the Catholic monarchs was not simply a personal defeat, but a final farewell to the last vestige of Muslim sovereignty in Spain. The curtain had fallen on a chapter that had shaped the land's identity, its faiths, and its very sense of self. The war for Granada, which began in earnest in 1482, unfolded as a series of sieges, battles, and shifting alliances. The Catholic monarchs marshaled formidable resources, florins to pay mercenaries and soldiers, artillery pieces known as falconets to batter stone walls, and a sense of religious mission that infused their campaign with urgency. The Nasrid Kingdom of Granada, hemmed in and politically isolated, fought desperately, but the odds were stacked against it. Chroniclers of the time, both Christian and Muslim, recorded the grim procession of towns and fortresses falling one by one until only the city of Granada itself remained. The final siege was marked by privation within the city's walls and a mounting sense of inevitability. In the end, negotiation replaced battle. Muhammad XII, also known as Boabdil, weighing the suffering of his people, agreed to terms of surrender that would, at least for a moment, guarantee the safety and religious freedom of Granada's Muslim population. But the ink on those agreements would soon run dry. With the annexation of Granada to Castile, the Catholic monarchs achieved a political and religious unification unprecedented in the peninsula's history. The fall of Granada was not merely the end of a war, it was the beginning of a profound transformation. Almost immediately, the new rulers took steps to secure their achievement, not only on the battlefield, but in the minds and souls of their new subjects. The narrative of the Reconquista of Christian recovery and Muslim defeat was cemented in chronicles, sermons, and public ceremonies. The symbolism of the event did not go unnoticed. January 2, 1492, became a date etched into Spain's collective memory, celebrated and invoked in the centuries that followed. The immediate aftermath for Granada's Muslim population was fraught with uncertainty. The terms of surrender, initially generous, promised protection for life, property, and the practice of Islam. For a brief period, a degree of coexistence endured as old rules of convivencia flickered in the shadows of the Alhambra. But the tide soon turned. Within a decade, mounting pressure from the monarchy and the church led to a campaign of forced conversions and, eventually, expulsions. The distinctive culture of Granada, its mosques, its scholars, its artisans, was systematically dismantled, and the city's Muslim inhabitants were faced with a stark choice: convert to Christianity or leave their homeland. With this, the civilization that had once made southern Spain a center of learning and art was brought to an abrupt and painful end. The consequences of the Reconquista's conclusion rippled outward, shaping Spanish society in ways both immediate and enduring. One of the most profound changes was the consolidation of Catholicism as the sinew of national identity. The victory in Granada was framed as a triumph of faith, and the monarchy moved swiftly to reinforce religious uniformity. The Spanish Inquisition, established a decade earlier, intensified its scrutiny, targeting not only Muslims but also Jews and so-called conversos, those who had recently converted to Christianity. The expulsion of Jews from Spain, which followed the fall of Granada, marked the end of centuries of Jewish life on the peninsula and brought a sudden rupture to communities that had long contributed to Spain's economic and intellectual vibrancy. The period of convivencia, already eroded by years of suspicion and conflict, was now decisively over. The economic consequences of the Reconquista's end were significant and complex. Scholars analyzing the aftermath have noted that the redistribution of land and privilege in formerly Muslim territories led to patterns of inequality that would persist into modern times. Much of the land confiscated from Muslim nobles and communities was granted to Castilian elites, soldiers, and religious orders loyal to the crown. This process concentrated economic and political power in the hands of a relatively small segment of society, particularly in the regions that had been most recently conquered. These patterns, once established, proved remarkably durable, helping to shape the contours of Spanish regional development and wealth distribution for centuries to come. The unification of Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella, achieved through both conquest and dynastic marriage, set the stage for a new era of empire and ambition. The sense of triumph and confidence that followed the conquest of Granada fueled the monarchy's willingness to look outward. The very year of Granada's fall, Christopher Columbus arrived at the royal court seeking support for his westward voyage, a journey that would inaugurate Spain's age of exploration and its far-reaching global empire. The legacy of the Reconquista thus became intertwined with the emergence of Spain as a world power, its sense of mission and destiny reinforced by the memory of victory over centuries-old adversaries. Yet the legacy of the Reconquista is not simply one of triumph or loss. It is also a story of memory, of how the events of 1492 and their aftermath have been remembered, interpreted, and contested in Spanish history. The consolidation of a Catholic identity was accompanied by the deliberate shaping of national consciousness, in which the narrative of Christian victory and the expulsion of religious minorities took on a central role. Over time, this narrative was reinforced by institutions such as the Inquisition and by the laws and customs that defined who could belong to the Spanish nation. The memory of the Reconquista became a touchstone for Spanish identity, celebrated in festivals and invoked in times of crisis. It was also a source of controversy, as later generations reflected on the costs of religious and cultural homogenization. For centuries after the fall of Granada, the memory of Al-Andalus lingered in Spanish culture, not as a living presence, but as a lost world, sometimes romanticized, sometimes feared. The architecture of cities like Granada and Cordoba, the haunting melodies of Andalusian music, and the echoes of Arabic in the Spanish language all testified to a history that could not be fully erased. Yet alongside this sense of loss, there remained a persistent tension. For some, the Reconquista represented the fulfillment of a Christian destiny. For others, it stood as a symbol of intolerance and the dangers of enforced conformity. The processes unleashed by the Reconquista continued to shape Spanish society in the centuries that followed. The expulsion of Muslims and Jews and the relentless pursuit of religious uniformity laid the groundwork for a society in which difference was often viewed with suspicion. The Inquisition, with its apparatus of surveillance and punishment, became a powerful tool in the hands of the monarchy, targeting not only religious minorities but also those whose loyalty was deemed suspect. Over time, this contributed to a conservative strain in Spanish politics and culture, one that placed a premium on orthodoxy and obedience. At the same time, the memory of the Reconquista offered a source of unity and pride. The narrative of Christian endurance and victory provided a foundation for Spanish nationhood, reinforcing the monarchy's claim to legitimacy and shaping the collective self-image of the people. This identity, forged in the crucible of conflict and shaped by the experience of conquest, carried Spain into the modern era. It was invoked in the rhetoric of empire, in the justification for overseas expansion, and in the persistent debates about what it meant to be Spanish. The economic and social patterns established in the wake of the Reconquista had far-reaching implications. The concentration of land and privilege in the hands of a few helped to entrench regional inequalities, particularly between the north and south of Spain. These disparities, rooted in the aftermath of conquest, became a source of tension and debate in later centuries as reformers and critics grappled with the legacies of history. The processes set in motion in 1492 did not simply end with the fall of Granada. They reverberated through Spanish society, shaping everything from patterns of land ownership to the distribution of political power. Reflecting on the legacy of the Reconquista is to confront the complexity of Spanish history itself. The end of Muslim rule in Granada marked the close of an era, but it also opened new possibilities and dilemmas. The drive for religious and cultural unity, while bringing a measure of stability, came at a cost: the loss of pluralism, the silencing of voices that had once contributed to Spain's richness, and the creation of boundaries that would shape the nation's identity for generations. The debates about the meaning of the Reconquista and its place in the story of Spain continue to this day, as scholars and citizens alike grapple with the inheritance of a past that is at once glorious and tragic. As the dust settled over Granada and the banners of Castile were unfurled, the Iberian Peninsula was transformed. The conquest was both an ending and a beginning, a moment when the dreams and fears of centuries came to fruition and a new chapter began to unfold. The legacy of the Reconquista is visible not only in the monuments and chronicles of the past, but in the enduring questions it has left behind. What does it mean to belong? Who is included in the story of a nation, and at what cost? In the echoes of Granada's fall, these questions linger, shaping the conversations and identities of modern Spain and reminding us that history, however distant, is never truly settled.